चलो जी, आई थिंक आई एम ऑल सेट. कैन यू सी द स्क्रीन एज वेल? शेयर की हुई है मैंने तुम लोगों के साथ. कैन यू सी द स्क्रीन? राइट, ओके, गुड. चलो जी, लेट मी स्टार्ट. So I will start off by revisiting what we did last time related to consequences of current account deficits, and then we will take on things to our main topic for today, which is how to correct a current account deficit. Now, what we looked at last time, this entire screen that you see over here is the same thing I showed you in the class as well. So इसमें हमने ये देखा था कि this current account deficit, we learned that initially the main impact, the problem it creates is कि exchange rate पे pressure डालता है, and exchange rate tends to depreciate, which in turn means that there would be cost push inflation. But this can be a self-correction, that if you let your exchange rate depreciate, then this current account deficit will automatically self-correct. Why? Because when exchange rate depreciates, your export-import prices change, and therefore your country will adjust its exports and imports, and current account can sort of self-correct if you let the exchange rate depreciate. So that is where we say the one of the policies actually that you can use to correct current account deficits is exchange rate depreciation. So you are trying to defend your exchange rate, but we are saying if you let it happen, if you let it fall, so it can work as a policy which can correct your current account deficit. But in the last video, we then took the discussion towards the direction that countries, they have persistent current account deficits. It's not that they have a deficit in one-off year. So when you have persistent year upon year upon year of current account deficits, so this self-correction is not an option anymore, because you can't just let your exchange rate keep on depreciating. And from there, we then learned, okay, if you have persistent current account deficits, if you don't want to use this policy of exchange rate depreciation to correct it, then you have to balance your current account deficit. And the reason I'm starting off by going back to these things is to make sure that you understand कि जो आखिरी क्लास में हमने जब consequences पढ़े हैं current account deficit के, we were basically learning how a country can balance off a current account deficit, not correct it. Correction would be कि फिर exchange rate गिरने दो, but what we discussed was कि okay, we don't want the exchange rate to fall. We don't want to correct this trade imbalance. So we started to see how countries can then balance off current account deficits by trying to attract inflows in the financial account. And there we looked at all of these 3-4 different possibilities. If you are trying to balance off your current account deficit through the investment part, this section over here of the financial account, if you succeed, then it is good for your country. You are overspending and you have a current account deficit, but then you receive an opposing amount of inflows as foreign investments. If you can do that, if that is how you balance your current account deficit, we said it's not an issue, it's actually a good thing. But usually we said that if you think about developing countries जहाँ पे ये balance of payments के problems होते हैं, they are not usually able to attract foreign investments. So they have to sort of play around with these 3 other sections of the financial account and try to attract dollar inflows to balance off current account deficit. And we saw that each of these 3 different sources of inflows, international loans, saving deposits, central banks, FX reserves, they can work, but they can work for a short time, and then they have their own difficulties. If you are trying to, let's say, attract hot money flows, we said interest rate बढ़ाना पड़ेगा, so your domestic economy will be squeezed. If you take international loans, so you will become an indebted country which has problems of its own. And similarly, FX reserves, we said countries, if they keep too many FX reserves, first of all, they don't have the capacity, and secondly, there is a huge opportunity cost involved. Now, as I said, the reason I'm repeating all of these things, remember again and again, all of these problems due to current account deficits arise as you try to sort of stubbornly persist with current account deficits, and then instead of trying to resolve them, you just keep on trying to balance them off by attracting inflows in financial account. So that was the story of the last class. Now we actually want to see कि long-term solution for countries with persistent deficits is कि आपको resolve करने हैं. You have to actually correct your current account deficits. You can't keep on playing this balancing game. तो when it comes to correcting a deficit of the current account, उसमें सबसे पहले go to your basics, remind yourselves कि current account deficit, the start of the entire problem. Yes, there are 3 sections of current account. Theoretically, it can go into a deficit because of outflows from either of these 3 sections. But remember, it is the imbalance of trade. Basically, it is the trade deficit that throws the entire current account into a deficit. And उससे भी अगर simplify करो तो basically the whole problem, the root cause is that your countries usually that have current account deficits, their root cause of this problem is they import too much. So every year they spend too many dollars and they don't export enough, and therefore they can't earn enough dollars. So that is the root cause of a current account deficit. And therefore, the first thing I want you to understand is that to resolve a current account deficit, to correct a current account deficit, this is exactly what a government needs to do. It needs to make policies that somehow, directly or indirectly, makes your country, let's say, import less than before and export more than before. Any policy that can achieve that will correct the country's trade deficit, and therefore you will be able to correct the country's current account deficit. So ये पहले broad principle, this is what I want you to understand. इसको mix ना करना, balancing off the current account deficit. Even if you are successful, maybe तुम investments inflow attract कर लेते हो, but you are still balancing off a current account deficit. You are not getting rid of it. Now we want to learn how to get rid of current account deficit by controlling the over import and sort of boosting the exports of your country. Once you understand policies to correct current account deficit basically means policies that can force your country to import less and export more. Those are the policies that will correct your current account deficit. Now, usme, and let me write it down. So policies to correct current account deficit. Now there are many different policies. We will look at specific details of a few of those policies, but सबसे पहले तुमने जो चीज़ समझनी है that broadly speaking we think in terms of 2 broad categories of policies. So on the one hand we have, and let me do this in a different color. So on the one hand you have expenditure switching policies. So expenditure switching meaning you want to switch expenditure, and I'll explain what actually that means. And then on the other hand you have expenditure dampening policies. So as I said, I will tell you the specific policies, but पहले ये difference समझना तुमने, the expenditure dampening versus expenditure switching. Now this is really simple. All that we are thinking about here is that imagine that Pakistan is a country. Every year, let's imagine it spends $200 billion on goods and services. And let's assume that $150 billion of this total sum is spent on local Pakistani products. I'm just making up numbers over here. And $50 billion, let's assume, is spent by Pakistanis on foreign products, on imports. So let me write both the things, foreign products, FOR for foreign, and we are talking here about imports. Now if the problem of your country is you have a current account deficit, so let me just signify that current account deficit problem like this. आपकी exports बहुत कम है, so small amount of exports, and you are importing too much. That is the problem that you are trying to resolve. Now expenditure dampening policies, think of them where the government sort of becomes very strict, and what it does is that since the country is over importing and spending too much on foreign products, throwing the country's current account into a deficit and creating a problem, then the government sort of behaves in a very strict way, and what they do is they try to dampen the overall expenditure of the country. Dampen से मतलब क्या है? To dampen something means to make it lesser. So basically the country's government, they try to make policies because of which the total expenditure that the economy is doing the total spending of the economy, which we were saying was $200 billion. Government tries to make policies जिसकी वजह से this total spending dampens. Maybe 200 की जगह people just start spending $150 billion, and as a result, since overall spending is lesser, hopefully they would spend less on imports as well, और आप अपना current account deficit ठीक कर लोगे. So that is your expenditure dampening policy. Now, how can you force the country to dampen its expenditure? How can you force the households and firms and all of these different sectors to start spending less? Well, expenditure dampening policies may, without going into any details, because we know all the details of the particular policy, because what really happens is that to implement expenditure dampening policies, government simply comes in and implements tight monetary and tight fiscal policy. Now, these are the things that you should already know, that tight monetary policy means that the government would increase the money supply and lower the interest rate. We can also include exchange rate over here, but usko bhi leda rakho. Exchange rate ko look at as a separate macro policy from now on. Although you can include it in tight monetary policy as well. But the basic idea here is that if you implement this tight monetary policy or tight fiscal policy, which means this government would increase the rate of income tax and it would also reduce the amount of government spending. Now, what both tight monetary and fiscal policy will do is that if you have a country whose initially is in this equilibrium, let me write it down over here. So let's assume that this is the initial starting equilibrium of a country that faces a current account deficit. So according to this equilibrium, there will be certain price level and there would be a certain GDP that the country would be producing. And remember, we said that this GDP will equal to the total incomes that will exist in the economy and the total employment that will exist in the economy. Now we are saying if this country is facing a problem of overspending on imports, the government at the end, it says that, look, I'm going to dampen their overall spending. I'm basically going to make people more poor. And for that, they implement this tight monetary, tight fiscal policy, which means the aggregate demand of this country would shift to the left. And when aggregate demand shifts to the left to, let's say, AD1, the macroeconomic equilibrium will move to the left to this new point where your GDP and therefore the total amount of incomes in the country will fall. People will sort of in a way become poorer. And since their incomes will fall, overall incomes will fall, and therefore they will start spending less. They will start buying fewer goods and services, including fewer imports. So that is how expenditure dampening policies work. As far as your exam is concerned, look, the overall basic idea is really simple. तुम लोगों को गरीब करना चाह रहे हो. You want to just tell them that okay, we want to make you poor ताकि तुम overall ही खर्चा कम कर दो, and you will then ultimately that would involve lesser spending on imports. And to make people poorer, what these expenditure dampening policies actually are, it is tight monetary, tight fiscal policy. As far as your exams are concerned, usme give all of this detail. कि tight monetary policy is when you increase the money supply, then explain what that does, then explain separately that you can also lower the interest rate, explain how that works. So पूरी tight monetary, tight fiscal policy को explain करके link it up कि once it is implemented, aggregate demand shifts to the left, incomes in the economy fall, and therefore the economy as a whole will spend less, including lesser spending on imports. So your trade deficit will improve and your current account deficit will also ultimately improve. Now this जी ये किसी ने कुछ बोले आमना, was it you? हाँ जी बताओ. मैंने गलत बोल दिया. यस आई गुड, somebody picked it up. मैंने ये expansionary monetary policy, loose monetary policy का दिया. Tight monetary policy would be a lowering of money supply and a increase in interest rate. Good, you picked it up. So basically, I mean, again, remember, monetary and fiscal policy, we use it for a lot of reasons. But here we are, it's the same policy, but we are saying when it is specifically being used for this purpose, कि मुल्क को थोड़ा सा गरीब करो, economy को slow down करो. I have been saying that, make the people more poor, but basically what we are saying is that slow down the economy, and as it slows down, it will start spending less on imports as well. Now it looks like quite a stupid policy कि आपने पूरे मुल्क को ही गरीब कर दिया and you are trying to lower the incomes in order to control your current account deficits. But it is not that stupid a policy, because remember from the very beginning that sometimes the problem with countries is that they face a twin problem of inflation as well as a current account deficit. They face both the problems at the same time, and therefore they are looking for a policy जिससे दोनों चीज़ें ठीक हो जाएं. So if you notice over here, when you dampen the expenditure and sort of put a brake on the economy through tight monetary fiscal policy, तो एक तो when your income goes down, as I have just explained, you will import less because आप overall कम चीज़ें खरीद रहे हो, and therefore you will spend lesser on imports. So your current account deficit will come under control. And secondly, see, when you sort of decrease the aggregate demand of the country, the price levels also fall. So this is where you are basically saying कि आप economy को cool down कर रहे हो. You are bringing it from a very high amount of GDP to a slightly lower amount of GDP. So यहाँ पे this is where we are saying you are slowing down, you are contracting the economy, you are cooling it off. कि भाई slow down, buy lesser imports, spend less, or when you do that, price levels, they also start coming down. So expenditure dampening policies, they are especially useful for countries which are facing both of these problems together. But if you have to think in terms of the problems of this expenditure dampening policy, then obviously the problem is that whereas on the one hand you are resolving the issue of current account deficit, but then on the other hand you are shrinking your domestic economy. So, I mean, this sounds sort of confusing and circular, but this is the whole reason why macroeconomic policy making is difficult. There are these circles that if you try to correct one thing, then something else goes wrong, and when you could try to correct that other thing, तो वो पहले वाली चीज़ जो है वो ख़राब हो जाती है. So here expenditure dampening policy में you can sort of correct the external front, the current account deficit, by slowing down your economy. But as I said, economy का जो slow down है in itself is an other issue. मुझे बताओ कोई question, any confusion you can ask me. Now, expenditure dampening, it's very easy to explain. As I said, it's basically implementing tight monetary, tight fiscal policy, shifting the aggregate demand to the left. यही diagram के through तुम इसको exam में भी explain कर सकते हो. Now, expenditure switching policy is a different concept, it's a different idea. And what governments try to do through expenditure switching policy is that instead of, making the country poor, and instead of forcing the country to decrease its overall spending, through expenditure switching policies, the government attempts that, look, as a country, keep on spending whatever you are spending. So keep on spending the same $200 billion, but through these switching policies, governments, they try to convince the people to sort of, instead of spending on imports, they try to convince the people to start spending on local products. So यहाँ पे जो 50 billion imports पे लग रहा है, expenditure switching policies would try that maybe only 25 is spent on imports and the other 25 shifts toward local products. So you are trying to convince the locals, the people of Pakistan, if you are looking about or thinking about Pakistan's current account deficit. So you are trying to convince Pakistanis that don't spend on foreign products, instead spend that amount but spend it on local products. And similarly, expenditure switching policies also try that foreigners, people living in, let's say, US, UK and African countries, they are buying things from all the different countries of the world. So expenditure switching policies also try that, this US guy and this UK guy, instead of buying something from, let's say, Saudi Arabia, expenditure switching policies try to convince these foreigners also to switch towards Pakistani products. So that is what expenditure switching is. You are not trying to sort of slow down your economy. You are not trying to dampen the expenditures of your country. You are just trying that these expenditures switch away from the foreign products towards your own local products. And what that would mean is कि आपकी imports कम हो जाएंगी, local people will buy local products, and your exports should increase if foreigners actually switch towards your products. Now expenditure switching के लिए, and let me get rid of this thing over here so that we have more space. So expenditure switching के लिए basically in turn what you need is you want to change, or you need to change the export and import price. So if you want the foreigners to switch towards your local products and buy more exports, then you have to do something where your export prices decrease, and then likely foreigners will switch towards your product. And similarly, if you want to convince your own local people to stop buying from other countries and buy your own products, then you have to sort of make the imports relatively more expensive than what they are right now. Now, there are different ways in which the government can achieve this, different ways in which the government can try to control export-import price and therefore try that the foreigners and locals switch towards your own products. And the first specific expenditure switching policy that you need to know is exchange rate depreciation.